Missing the Detective. Written by Shaihara. Read by Arashi. Another day, a new week, and a few hours of school time for Kokichi to annoy the shit out of everyone until they now bow down to him as the ultimate supreme leader. Kokichi was infamous for his annoying nature, and eventually getting his own way with those crocodile tears until he laughs in their faces and shouts his iconic line. Anyone who hadn't got to know Kokichi would just think he's like a frustrating and spoiled kid who'd make you suck up to him if you made him mad. Well, that's in fact what most people thought. There, unsurprisingly, weren't many people who actually liked Kokichi. Apart from one boy. That one boy who stuck with him long enough to detect when he was lying, and when he was actually being truthful. That one boy he called his beloved, at first as a joke, but it soon became a thing, and now Kokichi couldn't address the boy as anything other than, "My beloved Shumai," unless he was in a bad mood. Kokichi found it entertaining, how he could make Shuichi worry and think about him without even hardly trying, so the little acquaintanceship he had with the detective wasn't a bother at all. Kokichi made his way through the halls of Hope Speak Academy, doing every little thing he could to annoy the people who he walked past, whether it was knocking books out of some girl's hand, he thinks her name is Sayaka, and giving her the crocodile tears when she slightly raised her voice at him, or whenever he was triggering Kyo when he touched some sacred sword. He had no clue what it was. He did kind of regret it, though, when he had gold all over his hands. The Supreme Leader took a seat at his desk when he eventually had arrived at the classroom, resting his feet on the desk as he swung back in his chair. "Kokichi, you shouldn't be leaning back on your chair. There are a million cases of—" Kiba began to say, Kokichi zoning out when he knew the robot would start telling him the facts. What? Was he going to say that he knew someone that fell backwards and cracked their head open? Yeah, because that's every teacher's story. Kokichi wasn't in the mood to listen to that nonsense. Instead, his eyes were on the door that he had walked through mere minutes ago. Class was starting soon, and his beloved still hadn't arrived yet, which, to Kokichi, was odd. Shuichi would always be here early in the morning with Kaede, Kaito, and Maki, when Maki had the patience to deal with Kaito, but instead, he wasn't here. The blackish-purple-haired boy didn't think much of it still. However, thinking he was just caught up in talking to the teacher. After all, there were lots of teachers who constantly stopped the detective whilst he was busy doing his own thing. In all honesty, coming here wasn't exactly necessary. Some people have their own things to do in the mornings. The only occasion where they would happen to be here is when there was some sort of announcement that would come over the intercom. Plus, Kaede would normally message the group chat if they had to be in class or not, so he knew there was a chance Shuichi could be busy. The only thing that was keeping him from fully believing that was the fact was the group always met in this classroom in the morning, and Shuichi was practically stuck to Kaede like they were together. Although Shuichi could have just messaged Kaede himself to say he wasn't coming in, it's not like Kokichi had to know where he was all the time, even though he would totally rather know where his beloved is. Just for reasons. Nothing special at all, of course not.
"Hey, you little abortion, why are you staring at the beautiful Miuruma's tits, huh?"
Of course, with the way Kokichi had spaced out, of course he had to, unfortunately, be staring right towards Miu, who he assumed had gotten up and walked over to his desk, her palms against the table. It was almost like she was trying to get her cleavage to jump out at him like God.
"Stop trying to get your tits out and go fuck or suck Kibo's metal dick."
An over-exaggerated was the noise Miu made at the mentioning of sex. Of course, that's the noise she would make. Kokichi wondered if the girl actually invented anything. Free will, of course. That wasn't to do with sex.
"Maybe then you can tell me of robots' orgasm." "Oh, you probably already know that, don't you, cum dumpster?"
Their mini rivalry wasn't anything new to anyone in class. It would start the same and end the same. Miu would make a comment that someone was staring at her, or just anything sexual, really, and Kokichi would degrade her, as Tenko once called it when she called him a degenerate male. Kokichi had just shrugged and said, "There's nothing degrading about the truth." Since then, the Supreme Leader would always try to get his own little comment every time she spoke. Miu had begun to rant about how she would make it a feature for Kibo, which Kokichi really didn't want to know, and then dragged the flushed robot out of the classroom. It was a nice way of getting rid of her for a good few hours. Not having much to do currently, Kokichi pulled out his phone and decided to text Shuichi. Normally, whenever Kokichi messaged him, Shuichi would answer within minutes to stop himself from being spammed by the troublemaker. But after the longest 5 minutes of his life, he still had no reply. He lightly groaned, sending another text. Yeah, he was gonna be that kind of guy right now. Kokichi would have spam called Shuichi too if he felt more annoying, but he decided to give his beloved a break rather than dealing with this right now. The only person he would actually have some sort of consideration for.
Did he not tell you?
Kokichi practically jumped out of his skin, which was a first considering how aware he was of his surroundings, looking back at the blonde female with a slight glare for scaring him.
Tell me what?
Kokichi asked with a little huff, crossing his arms. His beloved not telling him something important?
Never. Shuichi isn't in the same country as us right now. He's out doing some detective work. He didn't say when he'd be back, just that he would be gone,
she explained, showing him the little message she had sent her as an explanation. The short teen hummed, clicking his phone off when he realized he wasn't going to get a reply any time soon. It would be fine. He would continue his normal life without Shumai. He doesn't care if Shuichi isn't here. He's lived plenty of his life without him. This would make no difference to him. Week 1. It had been a whole week without Shuichi. Sure, things definitely got a little more boring without him, but it wasn't the end of the world. However, Kokichi would have thought that the dark blue-haired detective would have at least taken some time out of his day to reply to his text messages. Did he mean that little to him? Unacceptable behavior. Kokichi would most certainly scold the other for being a fake friend. Kokichi didn't like fake people. No, gaining Kokichi's trust was a hard game, made extra hard by the one himself. Normally, he would be bugging the life out of his beloved, but instead, he just bugged the life out of Shuichi's friend group instead. Kaede could deal with his torments. Maki just threatened to murder him as the ultimate assassin, and Kaito's weird nature made him unaffected by the bothersome supreme leader. Seeing how his evil plans failed against them, Kokichi had let out the crocodile tears, crying about how they were mean for not playing along. Kaito and Maki weren't falling for it, but Kaede, her poor sweetheart, fell for the little trap, and somehow ended up buying Kokichi a couple of bottles of Panta. Week 2. Kokichi often stared out the window and wondered when his beloved would arrive back. It had been 14 days since he was last told the news of Shuichi not being here, and he still hadn't gotten a single reply back. Not that Kokichi cared, of course. He just was a little worried, that's all. It was nothing new. Kokichi would always be worried about one of his 10,000 members of DICE if they actually ever got in trouble. He wasn't completely and utterly heartless, but Shuichi actually meant something to him. He meant he was the guy who actually let Kokichi bother him, or the guy who actually cared about Kokichi's health rather than just being like all those other people. He was giving the Supreme Leader something he had been secretly wanting for a while now, and that was someone who loved him. Well, Kokichi didn't love his beloved Shumai. No, of course not. Kokichi could never get those feelings for a detective, but he would love it if Shuichi did love him. Platonically, obviously. Kokichi could never see himself in a romantic relationship. At least, he thought he couldn't. But as his thoughts that used to be so carefree turned into worry for Shuichi, he half doubted himself. Not that he would show that to anyone. He couldn't. He couldn't help but let his mind drift to the little hugs they shared when he would let out one of those crocodile tears. Despite knowing it was fake, Shuichi still felt guilty and upset about seeing Kokichi cry, and would give him a little hug, as if he were trying to cheer him up. The shorter man would always accept the hugs that he was given, almost gripping onto the back of the detective's shirt, as if he never wanted to let go. Kokichi was simply attached. That's what he would say. He couldn't love beloved Shumai. He just couldn't. Week 3. Kokichi would start wearing the jumper Shuichi had given him as a gift when he was cold in the wintertime. He still wore his usual outfit, so it's not like anyone noticed, but it gave him the comfort that he needed. He was walking down the hallway of the school, looking for Shuichi's best friend so he could talk to her. Of course, talking to Kaede was absolutely revolting to him. She was too nice. But if Kokichi were to be around his beloved, he had to get used to being nice to his friends. When the pianist was in sight, he sighed and walked over to her, tapping her on the shoulder. Hearing Kaito groan in disapproval of his presence made him immediately annoyed, but he kept that behind bars. After all, he was here for the better K-named person. Kaede didn't seem bothered by him, probably because she was slowly but surely getting used to his antics too. Suddenly, talking seemed a lot more difficult. Nothing coming out of his mouth when he wanted to talk. It was pretty uncharacteristic of Kokichi, so Kaede's interest was already piqued. Can we... he finally managed to get out. getting caught on the word talk. Kokichi hated talking. He couldn't stand opening up about his feelings. He would rather keep it to himself. No one ever helped him before. What would make any of these stupid ultimates different? Talk! He finally whispered, staring down at his own hands as he played with a ring Shuichi got for him. The detective had noticed how angsty he often got, and bought him a ring as a distraction. You keep your feelings hidden away too much. You really should talk about them to someone, even if it's me. That's what Shuichi had told him before explaining the ring. If you're ever worried or nervous on the inside, and you don't want to show it with expressions and words, play with the ring. It'll help you get your mind off things. That's what Shuichi had said. Kokichi took his advice. He would only listen to the detective. No one else really mattered. Week 4. It had been a week since Kokichi told Kaede he was missing Shuichi, and basically a month since Shuichi had left him without even sending a text. Did he mean nothing to him? Kokichi knew he meant something to the detective, but was it not enough for him to give him a heads up? He needed attention that only Shuichi could provide for him to be satisfied. Nothing else would do. He needed a hug from his beloved. A hug from his recently developed crush. That's what Kaede had told him. Of course, Kokichi was quick to deny the accusation and faked being angry, storming out of her dorm room. But the more Kokichi thought about it, the more he realized how true it was. He showed every sign of having a crush on Shuichi. He couldn't deny it anymore. He missed Shuichi more than anyone else. Sure, it definitely did have a little effect on everyone in his class, but no one cared as much as he did. No way did they care as much as him. Kokichi would send another text his way, asking him to text back as soon as he could. Kokichi just wanted to see some sort of life from the other end of the phone. Shuichi could be dead for all he knows. The Supreme Leader would end up breaking into Shuichi's room with his undeniably amazing lockpicking skills, taking the hat he always used to wear. Shuichi was probably in a rush. There's no reason for it to be discarded on the floor so messily. Kokichi would lazily put the too big cap on, wandering back to his own dorm room after making sure no one was there to see him leave the detective's room. Week 5. It had been over a month, and Kokichi didn't bother getting out of bed. He would hug his pillow in hopes that it would be Shuichi's body instead, but hoping for something like that was just stupid. Kokichi had come to the conclusion that Shuichi was actually dead. There was no way that he was still alive. He couldn't be. There was no way his beloved would leave him without a reply for 5 weeks. Kokichi couldn't count how many times he had cried this week. Despite his thoughts of Shuichi being dead, he just wished he could come back. It was almost like he cried out of desperation, desperate that Shuichi would return to him right that second. But it never happened. There was no text message, no call, no knock on the door with a Shuichi holding flowers in his hand and a sorry for being gone for so long, followed with a kiss. Not that Kokichi wanted one. Nothing at all. Kokichi found it ironic how he was the thief, yet he had had his heart stolen. He had never wanted someone with him so badly in his life. Well, he didn't want just anyone. He wanted Shuichi. He wanted his detective so badly. Please, come back, Kokichi would mumble to himself. Not that Shuichi would hear him, but he needed to say it. Never in Kokichi's life did he expect to be praying for someone to come back into his life. But here he was, practically begging for Shuichi's presence on his bed. He just wanted Shumai back. Was it that much to ask for? Week 6. Kokichi had finally come back to class. It was a combination of Kirumi and Rantaro that managed to convince him back into the class. It was a strange duo, but it was the guilt he felt for making Kirumi constantly come to his room to give him food, and Rantaro saying how he was certain Shuichi would be back. Of course, it wasn't exactly convincing at all, but the mention of Shuichi being back was enough to convince him to come. However, it didn't matter that much. Kokichi fell asleep at his desk from the awful sleeping habits he'd gained over the weeks of Shu being gone. Kokichi didn't even hear the commotion. He was that tired. He wouldn't care anyway. Even if he was not awake, Kokichi did end up stirring away a little, but it wasn't like he was paying any sort of attention. Instead, he turned his head to the side and stared out the window, drifting off into a daydream about his beloved. However, a certain name spoken on the TV immediately grabbed his attention. Shuichi Saihara, a young detective, has been missing for the past 4 weeks. If you see him, call the local police immediately. He was last seen at Haneda Airport before he later disappeared. Kokichi zoned out at the news playing on the TV after that. His beloved. Missing? For 4 weeks? Why had they only just been informed about this? Kokichi listened to the mutterings of the class. looking out of the lightly watercolored window. What if Shuichi was trapped outside? He'd get absolutely soaked. Kokichi would just hope that he would be found soon. No, he couldn't wait for the police to find him. He had to go find him himself. There was no way he was just going to sit around and wait when he could be out there dying. However, his plans were stopped when he heard Kaito talking. Over the 6 weeks, he'd gotten more and more sick of Kaito even existing, with his stupid hair and so stupid goatee. "He's probably dead," the much taller man had said, Angie laughing a bit.
"But Atua has spoken and says Shuichi is very much alive, and Atua is always correct."
As much as Angie also got on his nerves, he would gladly agree with her right now, just for the sake of Shuichi. He would never believe that Shuichi was dead until he saw it with his own eyes. So right now, he was still alive.
"Yeah, Shuichi is definitely alive. There's no way Shuichi could be dying that easily,"
Kaede spoke, clasping her hands together. He couldn't agree less. Shuichi wouldn't leave that easily. Surprisingly, he was willing to put up a fight when he really had to. Shuichi wouldn't leave him that easily. He could never. Never. Week 7. Kokichi had Kaito on the ground in the most uncomfortable position he could get him. That involved Kokichi nearly dislocating Kaito's shoulder with how hard he pressed against it with his knee, not really controlling the anger he let on the very surprised astronaut. Since the news last week, Kaito had been constantly on about how he's dead whenever someone would mention Shuichi's name. At first, Kokichi could deal with it. After all, he'd had to deal with much more annoying people in his life. Mew. But this was just pushing the limits until he broke. The small male wasn't sure which was better, verbally attacking him or physically, but his mind clearly told him to do both. Well, it's not like he was even thinking straight in the first place. Even if he did make a choice, he wouldn't be able to stop himself. 1 punch, 2 punch, 3 punches. People were watching. But Kokichi didn't care. Not even one bit. He had to do this. There was no way he couldn't now. He had to get his anger out. No sympathy, no mercy. "He's not dead! He's not dead!" Kokichi would shout at him, followed by a few more punches that probably felt like nothing to Kaito. How many punches would it take for those 3 words to get stuck in Kaito's tiny brain? Kokichi certainly would have begun punching him more and more until he bled, or until he knocked all his teeth out, but he was pulled away from the purple-haired male, who was on the floor in a dazed state, before he could do any more to him. Kokichi spent another week in his room after being put on house arrest. Week 8. Coffee wasn't his thing, not even a little, but Kokichi wanted a way of remembering Shuichi more. Sure, he'd snuck out of his dorm room while on house arrest to go to Shuichi's room, but it wasn't enough. Even dressing up a pillow in his shirt and spraying it with a subtle spray wasn't enough for him. He wanted some body heat. He wanted to hear his heartbeat. Neither of those he could get from a pillow. He wanted to feel skin. Was it so much to ask for? It had been 2 whole months since Kokichi last felt Shuichi's presence. He couldn't believe he thought this would be no issue whatsoever. It wasn't the end of the world, his ass. Kokichi was missing his world, his heart and soul, the only thing he really even cared about. His head was flat on the table he was sitting at, and he was practically asleep again. Not even coffee could keep Kokichi awake. Not that he had wanted to be awake anyways. The feeling of despair was too strong for Kokichi to even control right now. He felt like every little thing would aggravate him, and it probably would, if he were completely honest. Week 9. "Kaede, I really miss him," Kokichi spoke as he lightly swung his legs back and forth on Kaede's bed, gripping a little on the stupid music-themed duvet cover. Kokichi, honestly, didn't know what he was doing here. He hoped that being with someone would help him with his issues of missing the detective, but it never worked. He was with Kaede for a whole 4 days, which felt like hell having Kaito simply near him, but it hadn't helped at all. Kokichi hadn't given up on his beloved arriving back to apologize for the literal hell he had put him through, but he was getting a little worried that Shuichi wouldn't return, and for some unknown reason, the only person he could stand to be near was Kaede. Maybe it was because her hope for Shuichi's return was as high as his, or maybe it was simply because she was his closest acquaintance when his beloved was out of the picture.
"Don't worry, Kokichi. I'm sure Shuichi is fine. Next week he'll walk through that classroom door and everything will be fine," she spoke, way too enthusiastically for Kokichi's mind to comprehend. But he also couldn't help but feel a little more comforted by it. Kokichi couldn't lie and say he wasn't softening up a little to the piano bitch, as Mew loved to call her, allowing her to give him a little hug. Tell no one about this. Sure, Kokichi would hug people, but it would just be to annoy them, not because he liked their existence. Kaede had just softly laughed at his request, or perhaps demand, and softly nodded. Kaede was good with secrets. The only person she would tell was Shuichi, in case he needed her to keep an eye on him. "You owe me a bottle of Panta if you're wrong," he added on, as they both pulled away from the weirdly nice hug. "What do I get if I'm right?" she asked, Kokichi rubbing his chin. What should he give her? For once, Kokichi actually wanted to be fair about this, only because it was about his beloved. Anything else, and Kokichi would just lie about the reward and laugh. "I won't do annoying stuff to you purposefully." And for Kaede, that probably meant the world, immediately agreeing. Kokichi would probably accidentally annoy her in one way or another. This was Kokichioma after all. He was born annoying. Week 10. 10 weeks. 10 full weeks. 2 whole months. And a little more had passed since Kokichi was told about Shuichi's leave. As more students packed into their class with no sights of Shuichi, Kokichi gave Kaede a look from his desk, raising a brow. Kaede simply shrugged and pointed to her watch, basically telling him to be patient. Kokichi? Patient? Never. He wanted him now, not in a few minutes. Soon the teacher had wandered in just to get them all marked off as being here, and there were no new announcements, and no news he had to say. Kokichi dejectedly slumped back in his seat, continuing to stare at the door. Nakito would say how hopeless he was. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and there was still no arrival from Shuichi. He couldn't help but wonder if Shuichi was actually dead. After all, there were no signs of him, and Kokichi was starting to think that Shuichi might have been transported to a different country again. Or even worse, he could have been dumped on an abandoned island. Kokichi didn't want to think that way, but it was almost hard not to think like that when it had been this long. Shuichi Saihara, the stuff Kokichioma would do just for you to walk through those doors right now and... "Sorry, I'm late!" It was like the world could read Kokichi's mind, Shuichi appearing in the room. From what Kokichi could see, Shuichi looked perfectly fine, which was good. Otherwise, he'd have to send some dice members after whoever the culprits were. The first to speak was Kaede. "Ha! I told you he would be here!" she practically shouted, doing what Kokichi thought was a victory dance. It was awful, whatever it was, giving the detective a hug. It was almost like Kaede's shouts brought everyone back to their senses, wanting to crowd around Shuichi to see him. Kokichi, however, stayed in his seat. He couldn't believe that Shuichi actually returned. Of course, he had been wanting this, but what the fuck? Kokichi looked down to check his phone, noticing how many messages had been seen. How did he not notice it before? Then again, that could have been anyone who read Kokichi's messages, not necessarily Shuichi. A lot of people gave Shuichi a hug, whilst others just verbally showed their relief about Shuichi's return. "What kind of degenerate male goes away without saying a word? You should be ashamed of yourself!" Well, they showed it in their own ways. Kokichi couldn't really show that he missed Shuichi. No, he had a reputation he needed to keep now that Shuichi was back. He would wait for the detective to approach him, so he looked out the window to distract himself. But he mainly used it to look at students from their reflection. At least then he would be able to distinguish whether or not Shuichi would even bother greeting him. Kokichi doesn't know why his beloved wouldn't bother greeting him after disappearing for so long. A long 5 minutes passed, and the students were scattering back to their seats. Kokichi watched Shuichi's reflection look his way, but then he turned away and began walking to what he imagined was his own seat. Sure, it definitely hurt Kokichi a little, and he wasn't really going to complain. After all, it wasn't really new. Kokichi was always left out. Hell, he would probably be left out of his own birthday if anyone even bothered to celebrate it with him. Kokichi sighed to himself, hearing no more footsteps walking about. The noise in the classroom resumed as if Shuichi hadn't just come back after being reported missing, and Kokichi continued to wonder why he didn't come over to him. The class passed by, and the bell rang to signify that they could leave, Kokichi slowly standing up. Seeming as his beloved couldn't care less about making sure he was okay, he decided that he would probably just go back to his room. He didn't want to do any work today, and he didn't fancy seeing his dice members in a state like this, so he would just laze about on his bed. He was tired from all the worrying he'd been doing for the past 2 months, and Kokichi felt like he deserved a little break. Putting a slight smile on his face, the short male left the classroom he had been situated in for too long and wandered to his dorm room. A certain someone told me that you were worried. I apologize for not answering the text messages. My phone was taken off me within the first week of being away. I was also told a couple of other things. We should probably talk. I'll be at your dorm room by 8 p.m. Kokichi noticed how he didn't even sign the note, but it was so obvious to him by both the context and the writing.
Soon, his beloved was going to talk to him, and he'd better get a damn explanation as to why he didn't greet him. But still, he couldn't stop that idiot's smile on his face. It was so real that it hurt his poor cheeks. 8 p.m. It had reached 8 p.m., and Kokichi had not long finished the curry Kirumi had made. He did ever wonder if the ultimate maid did take a little break from working. Shuichi should be on his way right now. Kokichi was still in his pajamas by this point. It honestly slipped his mind that Shuichi would even be coming here until he remembered after dinner, but he didn't have the time to get change. Plus, he'd find it a bit embarrassing if Shuichi were to see him half-dressed. Not that the detective would look anyways. Oh no, his eyes would probably be covered and his presence would disappear along with the door slam. At first, Kokichi was worried that Shuichi would never actually come. After all, this was Kokichi. But after only 5 minutes, there was a knock at the door. The owner of the room jumped off the bed and swung open the door, revealing exactly who he wanted to see, but not as he expected. Shuichi wasn't wearing his hat, nor his usual outfit either, really. It was more casual, a black jumper and some blue jeans. They were gray-blue, but that's what he would call them. And no hat? That was even better.
Wow, Shihara, you know what color is. And you took off that silly hat.
Kokichi mocked Shuichi, not even reacting in a negative way, and just gave him a smile and... Flowers? They were blue and small. Well, sort of small. They looked small to Kokichi, the male slowly taking them from his hand. And flowers, he commented in a confused tone, an evidently confused tone, moving out of the way to let Shuichi in. Kokichi locked the door behind him. He didn't want any unwanted visitors right now, and placed the flowers on his table gently. After all, they were from his beloved, after all. He couldn't dare treat them poorly. "They're forget-me-nots," Shuichi spoke, his hands mindlessly playing with each other. He was nervous. That much was clear to Kokichi. Said boy sat down on the bed beside him, his legs crossed and his body facing towards Shuichi. This was the best way he could think of that proved he had all his attention on him. Kokichi rested his head on Shuichi's shoulder, just staying quiet so that the dark blue-haired detective could talk. "They symbolize true love and respect. It represents a promise that you will always remember them, and will keep them in your thoughts," he explained. Kokichi froze just a little. Well, that was rather intimate, he would like to think. Wait, what was even this moment? "I missed you," he added on, a lump in both of their throats. Kokichi was almost certain he could hear Shuichi's heartbeat from his shoulder, and he most certainly could feel it with how close the blackish-purple-haired boy decided to sit next to him. He couldn't tell if his Shumai was being serious, or if he was just trying to make him feel better. You'd think the answer would be obvious, and it was to Kokichi. He had found it hard to believe.
"Silly Shumai, leave the lying to me,"
Kokichi spoke, laughing a little. "There's no way my beloved actually missed me," he mumbled, gasping a little when Shuichi turned to him way too quick for his brain to grasp. "I did! I really did, Kokichi!" Shuichi almost shouted while taking both of Kokichi's hands. Silence. Silence is what followed them after Shuichi's little outburst. Kokichi was too busy processing what had just happened, while Shuichi was wondering how he even managed to get that out, and why his first plan of action was to grab his hands. The detective could almost feel his heart fall out of his chest, whilst a minor blush was on both of their faces. It really stood out from how pale their skin was. I mean, you know," he tried to speak, but he couldn't even figure out what to say. Luckily for both of them, Kokichi had recovered from his utter shock, covering Shumai's mouth with his hand, and let out a much more nervous and shaky laugh. "Stupid Shumai, not thinking." This seemed like a perfect opportunity for him to admit stuff, too. He didn't know how he was going to, but he would do this. He needed to. "I missed my beloved Shumai, too. A lot." Kokichi leant forward and rested his forehead against Shuichi's, pressing a hand to his cheek. "Shumai probably think that's a lie, though. But it's not. I'm telling the truth." Kokichi could feel a soft, but quite cold hand on the back of his neck, making him shiver a little. "I believe you, Kokichi," he whispered, the hand moving upwards into his hair. Never in a million years did Kokichi think he'd end up in a situation like this, where he was with Shuichi, holding him close and...
"Kokichi!"
Kokichi's heart was going mental. He put his hand to his heart, feeling as it beated out of his chest pretty much. No, that was a dream? He looked over towards his door, where a worried Kaede was storming towards him, a much calmer Rantaro holding her arm so that she didn't practically jump over and tear his face off. Not that he reckoned Kaede could do that. She was too sweet for that. "You've been—" She tried to speak, but was shut up by Rantaro. "What she's going to say is you've been asleep for a whole day. Or practically a whole day. You fell asleep in class. You've been here ever since." He was much more calm than Kaede. She would have said it a lot more aggressively, moving his hand away when he felt as if she'd calmed down. A whole day?" His voice was a little off, but there was no surprise there. He had been dead asleep for around 20 hours. There was no way his voice would be great. "So, no shoe still?" He sighed, laying back down on the bed. Kaede and Rantaro shared a glance, the blonde being the first to act, sitting down on the bed beside Kokichi whilst Rantaro sat cross-legged by his feet.
"No, there's been nothing linked to Shuichi and his disappearance. I'm sorry, Kokichi."
Rantaro had already been filled in with the whole crush situation, so he wasn't exactly surprised when she apologized to him. Kokichi just rolled into her a little, resting his face on her leg. How could his brain be so cruel? Why mislead him down this road of hope, only to be met by crushing despair? Then again, when did the road of his life have an ending of hope? It was despairing. Just despair. How he hadn't fallen deep into despair was unknown to him. Maybe it's because Shuichi had too much hope for him to be like that. Shuichi would never like him the same way if he were just this despairing and ruined person. The two with him allowed there to be silence. Well, they were silent. Kokichi was sobbing. Talking right now seemed inappropriate. If they knew Shuichi, they'd know he'd ask him to make Kokichi happy until he returned back. So that's exactly what they were going to do. They were going to do this for Shuichi, whether Kokichi liked it or not. Week 11. Week 11 was certainly something. Kokichi had acknowledged Rantaro and Kaede were hanging around him together a lot more than she would be with Kaito and Maki, and Rantaro, well, he actually had no clue who Rantaro hung around with. If he were honest, he wasn't really expecting them to be hanging around with him. He'd understand them checking up on him, but not hanging around with him. Kokichi was just minding his own business one day, sitting in a tree as you do, when he suddenly hears, "Kokichi! Get down from that tree this instant!" Recognizing the voice, Kokichi looked down and saw the tree again. He could see Rantaro was saying something, but he couldn't quite read his lips. It was too difficult. Kaede's hands moved to her hips, and had that angry and disappointed mom look, whilst Rantaro just looked up at him and shrugged. The only reason why Kokichi got down was to tease Kaede about his discovery from the top of the tree. "You look like an angry mom while Rantan looks like a cool dad, which means you two did the nasty to produce me. How inappropriate, Kaede," he teased, loving how red her face went. Rantaro, on the other hand, looked pretty unfazed. Then again, that was his neutral expression, but there was no hiding the mild blush on his face. Nowhere near as noticeable as Kaede's, but Kokichi could immediately see it when he hugged his dad. The smaller male got a hug back. Damn, he was good at hugs, probably from all the sisters he has, the much taller one giving her a shrug. That set her off a little. "Don't just shrug, say something!" Rantaro looked down at Kokichi, seeing that grin of his, that would plead innocence but was nothing but guilty, scuffing up his hair a little. "Good kid," he spoke, deciding to play along with Kokichi's little scenario of them being parents, much to Kaede's disapproval shown by a groan. "Kaede, just play along with him." The look she got from him was as if to end off that sentence properly with a "for Shuichi." Kaede half regretted even giving herself into the situation, but if it would take his mind off of Shuichi, then she could try. What she didn't realize was that, later on that day, she'd have to be pressed up right against Rantaro and have Kokichi sitting in her lap while they watched a movie. And what made things even worse was the arm around her shoulder halfway through the movie night. She wanted to punch that grin off of Rantaro's face. Perhaps she'd been around Tenko too much, or even Maki when she had to third-wheel a date between her and Kaito. That was Kaede's worst third-wheel experience. Week 12. Sure, Rantaro and Kaede had been doing a good job of being parents. Actually, they were better parents than Kokichi expected together, but it was still hard to get Shuichi off his mind. Even whilst he was sitting on Rantaro's shoulders as they went for a walk through the park together, Kaede, unfortunately, had already been taken out by Mew to test one of her new machines with Kibo. Kokichi did feel bad about her having to go and deal with that kinky freak, but it gave him more time with Rantaro, so he wasn't as bothered. Besides, Kokichi knew quite a bit about Kaede. He didn't know too much about the adventurer. He knew Rantaro kept to himself pretty much, and always had this calm expression on his face. That's all he knew, really.
It was strange how he could just be basically no one but a close friend in some people's lives. Maybe he was more than a supportive friend than anything. After all, he did grow up with a hell of a lot of sisters. Rentaro probably knows how to handle most things by this point. Well, that's what Kokichi would assume. There was no way of knowing what was actually going on through his head. He was one tough cookie to crack. Guess that makes two of them. Rentaro had his hands on Kokichi's thighs while the latter had his hands messing with that green hair. He really did remind him of an avocado. He had only thought about that when he was sat at a class lunch, and Angie had called Rentaro a walking avocado. That was funny, though, Kokichi had to admit. He could totally see it now that she had pointed it out. The walking soon came to a stop when Rentaro let Kokichi down, and laid out the blanket he brought so that they didn't get dirty or grass stuck to them. Kokichi gracefully accepted the panta he was given, leaning a little against the taller male. It was nice. The whole situation was a nice mental break from what he was going through, and the two sure had their ways of doing this correctly. And Kokichi was grateful about that. "What made you decide to start hanging around me with Kaede?" Kokichi spoke to break the comfortable silence the two of them had together. It was a question he had been wanting to ask, but he never thought there was a right time for it. Now seemed like a good time. "Well, Kaede was getting a little more worried about you when you had been asleep for a while. We were hanging out at the time, and I said I would tag along as emotional support. After that, she asked me if I could stick with her and you until Shuichi came back." "But why say yes? You could have just said no." Rentaro laughed as if Kokichi had said the dumbest thing ever, shaking his head. "Well, first of all, it seemed better for her mental state that I actually help her. And secondly, I care about you, little dude. We both do. Sure, we never really spoke before, just the odd conversation here and there, but that doesn't mean I don't care. Besides, you've been well down and uncharacteristic since Shu went. Not seeing you west with people is just wrong." That was too sweet for Kokichi. It was such icky and disgusting niceness, but he would accept it just because of how genuine it seemed, and because he was smiling a little too much. "You and Kaede, huh?" Kokichi spoke, his playful mood returning back in an instant as he wiggled his eyebrows at Rentaro. The ultimate adventurer simply laughed, poking Kokichi's hip. "How about we go on a double date when my beloved comes back?" Kokichi excitedly suggested, Rentaro cocking his head a little to the side. And after many, many pleases and whines later, he finally got Rentaro to agree with the suggestion, much to Kokichi's approval. Kaede wasn't the only one who could play matchmaker. "Pinky promise?" "Pinky promise." Rentaro locked his pinky around Kokichi's one and brought it up to his lips for a small kiss that was followed with Kokichi shoving his face back with his hand. "Hey, save those kisses for Kaede." Rentaro groaned, soon realizing this would be a recurring thing until something happened between the two of them, getting onto his knees. "Better start running, little man. Tickle Monster's coming for you." The two spent the last few hours of their outing messing about, Kokichi giving up to the Tickle Monster. He was rewarded with some panta and sweets, though, so it seemed like getting tickled to death was worth the reward. Week 13. It was like Rentaro and Kaede had switched positions, the avocado man not being available for today's wander whilst she was. He thinks he had to go to his house for some important family thing? Kokichi wouldn't know, but he thinks that's what Rentaro had quickly said when he had run past them. Maybe it was something about his missing sisters? For today, Kaede had decided to take Kokichi to a flower field. He had no clue why, but he didn't mind that much. After all, he could make a flower crown for himself. Or perhaps Kaede. She'd look nice in one, but she would most certainly rather one from Rentaro instead of him. However, they were just walking through the field in a little path to stop the flowers from being destroyed, so perhaps he couldn't make that crown after all. The two wandered through the fields, Kaede holding Kokichi's hand in order to keep him close by, almost like he would get lost or run off if she didn't keep him captive. Of course, though, Kokichi couldn't just freely tease Rentaro about Kaede and not vice versa. Besides, the blonde's reactions were certainly much more interesting than his. "Your hands are soft. Do you moisturize them often?" Kokichi started off with, so that he could make the tease unexpected. "I do sometimes. My hands are just naturally pretty smooth, if I'm being honest," she spoke, appreciating the compliment she had gotten. Yeah, that's when Kokichi turned it into some poor teasing. "I bet Rentaro would like your hands." That same familiar blush came onto her face, and pulled her hand away from Kokichi's to block his view of her face. "Nishishichi, Rentaro even agreed to a double date when Shumai returns," he added on, Kaede groaning. Wow, they both had the same reaction. That was funny to Kokichi. "It's obvious you both have feelings for each other. Why not just— Ow!" Kaede had enough of his nonsense, even though everyone knows it's true, giving him a slap to the arm. He rubbed said arm and frowned, but didn't bother with the crocodile tears. He knew Kaede would call him out for his lying tear eruption, so he just looked upset instead. Kokichi, don't put that look on your face. You damn well deserved it.
Okay, perhaps not, but he could totally play along with it. It wouldn't be that difficult.
How do you deserve to be slapped when you're denying your feelings for your beloved? I'm just making it clear for you.
Kaede fell silent, and Kokichi was celebrating. They came to a stop on a bench nearby to give their legs a break, and because Kokichi was complaining about how tired his poor legs were, the two sat in a comfortable silence.
You know, I didn't want to believe I had feelings for Shumai.
The boy spoke after a nice rest of his legs, swinging them back and forth whilst he held the edge of the bench.
But a selfish part of me didn't want to see him with anyone else. I wanted to be the person he was with. So I just accepted how I felt. Even if Shumai doesn't feel the same, at least I know I tried, and that selfish part of me will go. Do you feel the same, Kaede?
He explained, wanting to know if their thought processes and feelings were the same.
Do you hate the feeling of a mommy with someone else?
He asked again, just to be clear on the question, looking over at Kaede. She was a sweet person. It was hard to think of her as jealous and selfish unlike Kokichi, but with a nod of her head, she confirmed that they both did in fact feel the same way about each other. For how long, Kokichi would never know.
You know, for an annoying ass like you, you're actually nice sometimes, she commented, and Kokichi gave her a side hug, a smile on his face.
Aw, thanks, Akamatsu-san. As much as she tried hiding it, she still had a highly visible smile on her face, too, giving him a little hug back. They stayed like that for a little while before continuing their walk, having a tame conversation here and there. The walk was refreshing, and Kokichi had definitely enjoyed it more than anything. Well, with exceptions, but it had been one of the nicest things he'd had in 13 weeks. Week 14. Kokichi was just sitting on his bed when he suddenly had plans. He figured he'd better go out to his dice hideout. He hadn't been there in so long because of all of this missing Shuichi drama. He figured they deserved a visit. Kokichi grabbed his stuff out of his wardrobe and changed into his much cooler outfit. It totally wasn't the same thing again, and left for his hideout. He hopes his second-in-command was doing a good job keeping this smooth and steady. Kokichi would lie and say it's hard to keep them in check, but it's really not. It's rather easy. You just promise them a place to stay, and you're all sorted. Weird, but he wasn't complaining. The walk to the hideout wasn't that far away from the school. It was rather close, if he were being honest. Easy access, but they were more likely to be spotted by these dumbass ultimates. Sure, he was one himself, but he was the ultimate supreme leader. That was better than anyone else's ultimates. What was he even on about right now? All he had to do was go in there, show his face so they'd know he's not dead, and then be set. He could leave again for another 14 weeks if he really had to. However, when he came back, he was greeted by the actual unexpected. Like, there was no way he could have known this. Why did no one tell him? Sitting in a chair in the middle of the hideout, with duct tape around his wrists and body to keep him in the chair, was Shuichi. Kokichi didn't know if he was having some fucked up dream again, if he was angry, or if he was relieved to see his beloved was okay. Shuichi gave him a little wave from the chair, Kokichi having come over immediately. There's no way he's seeing what he's actually seeing. "We caught your detective!" one of his members shouted. He didn't remember any of their names if he was being truthful. Most of them had no names. "Yeah, he was snooping around our hideout," another shouted, Shuichi sighing. "For the 100th time, I was following a trail of clues, not snooping. In fact, I wasn't even coming in here. The trail didn't lead down here," he explained in the most fed-up tone ever, like he had actually been telling them that over and over again. Kokichi definitely knew how he was feeling now. "What the fuck?" he shouted towards his second-in-command. "You didn't bother telling me you basically kidnapped Shuichi?" He jabbed a finger in his chest as he spoke, his other hand clenched. How could they not tell him? He was literally their leader. He had to know everything. His second-in-command said nothing. Rather, he looked quite embarrassed if Kokichi had thought anything. "Everyone out!" he demanded, them all following his order, and went to each of their own rooms. When you think about it, it was quite amazing for a high school ultimate student to have this much of a base going for him. Then again, he's pretty sure this was some sort of bunker from the war. Kokichi wasted no more time and freed Shuichi from his restraints, the latter stumbling a little when he stood up, with Kokichi gripping his shirt and shoulder to make sure he didn't fall forward or smack the ground hard. After testing out his legs a little and seeming to regain his balance, Kokichi let his arms drop to the sides of him, inspecting Shuichi a little. He didn't seem hurt in any way, shape, or form, so he was glad about that. "They treated me pretty well. The DICE members.
They fed me and actually gave me things to drink, and they told me stories about their antics in exchange for my stories. They caused no harm," Shuichi explained, scratching the back of his neck as he spoke. Of course they treated him nicely. They weren't full-blown criminals, and Kokichi had made it clear that they should only treat the people who wronged them with the wrong actions. Either way, Kokichi was glad he was still healthy and all. However, he wouldn't just let that calm him down. A stinging feeling came to his palm as he slapped Shuichi. He wondered if it stung the other, the dark-haired male rubbing his now reddened cheek. "What the fuck was that, Shuichi? I mean, I understand if you have some detective work and all, but did you not consider telling me at all? I thought you were dead!" Sure, maybe the slap was a little much, but Kokichi couldn't help it. He had been put through an emotional roller coaster because of his stupid detective. He felt like he deserved it a little. Shuichi nibbled on his bottom lip, moving his hand away from his cheek. It stung. It really did. But Shuichi had to agree and say he did deserve it. After all, he'd feel the exact same way if it was the other way around. Kokichi didn't really have the patience for the silence he was receiving. He really never did have any patience, of course, but the patience bar was completely empty by this point, so he grabbed his shirt with both hands this time and yanked on it so he'd bend down a little, almost forcing him to look at him too. "Why aren't you saying anything?" His tone was a little bit calmer, but it still had the same malice behind it. I didn't think you cared." That stung. That stung more than his hand did, in fact. The stinging on his hand felt pathetic compared to the one in his heart. Did Shuichi really think that? "What?" Kokichi mumbled, his grip somehow getting tighter and tighter. He probably would have ripped Shuichi's shirt if he gripped it any tighter. "You're the only one who I initially opened up to. The only one I would ever allow to see me without a mask." He leant forward and dug his forehead into the other's chest, his grip loosening a little. "I mean, I know I don't show the fact that I care that much, but I really do. Shuichi, I thought it would be obvious with how I acted differently around you. I even don't lie as much around you." He continued on, feeling a pair of arms wrap around his back, giving soft rubs through his clothes. "I missed my detective," was how Kokichi finished off his little rant, hoping he hadn't said anything wrong. "I'm sorry," Shuichi simply said. Yet it meant the world to Kokichi. He felt a bigger hand take his, and a breath got caught in his throat when Shuichi kissed his fingers. This time, it was real. This time, an angered Kaede wasn't going to break into his room and almost kill him. "We should go back so I can prove I'm not dead." Shuichi had a point. Currently, Kokichi was the only person who knew he was alive, and well in his class, so going there would be a good idea. "How about tomorrow? You come to my room and give me apology cuddles?" Shuichi laughed and nodded his head in agreement, letting the shorter boy lead him back. It sure was weird seeing daylight again. Week 15. Shuichi had made his return back to the class that week, with Kokichi by his side. He was a little annoyed that Kaito said he knew he wouldn't be dead, but then again, he was kind of relieved that he didn't rat him out when Shuichi had asked where the bruises had come from. He was not in the mood for a long lecture about his actions. The class seemed to have just returned to their normal selves again, and were glad about Shuichi's return. Just like his dream, others had different ways of showing their relief, but Kokichi wouldn't complain unless someone was pissed about his beloved being back. It was a late Saturday evening, and Shuichi was reading a book in Kokichi's room, whilst Rantaro painted both the room's owner and Kaede's nails. He had offered to do Shuichi's, but the detective declined, due to his working attire not allowing nail polish. It made 0 sense to a lot of them, but Shuichi could never break the dress code. Shumai, look! Kokichi practically shouted and carefully jumped onto Shuichi, showing him his painted nails. They were nicely done, and Rotaro had stated that they would be staying on for a while from the gel he had used. Very nice, Kokichi. Despite seeming uninterested, Shuichi loved how happy he was over his nails. He did take a glance at them. Rantaro had done a good job at painting them, before his eyes set back to the page in his detective novel, Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. But that didn't exactly please the attention-needy Kokichi, his small hand moving in the way of the words so he'd pay attention to him. "Kokichi, will you please move your hand?" Shuichi sighed, moving the book away so he could continue reading. "But you can read that silly book whenever you want," Kokichi complained, knocking the book out of the poor detective's hands. Luckily, Shuichi often checked the page he was on, just in case he got interrupted, so the dark-haired male would be able to find his place again without much effort. "Nishishi, what is my poor beloved going to do without his book, He spoke with a slight tease, finding it more amusing how deadpan Shuichi's face looked. However, he was soon trapped in those arms of his, brought down to lay on that lean torso. Despite whining, Kokichi melted a little into the body he lay on, his body relaxing. I know you haven't been sleeping properly. You need to sleep. His voice was soft and calming, and his eyes couldn't help but fall shut at the demand. His arms wrapped around the warm neck, and probably could have purred at the feeling of his hair being stroked as if he was some sort of cat. It wasn't long before Kokichi had fallen into a deep slumber. He had needed this after so long. It felt obvious that he needed to rest. After all, he seriously hadn't been getting good sleep for 14 whole weeks. You two are cute together. When's the date happening? Kaede spoke from the other side of the room, Shuichi rolling his eyes. Not like she'd even seen him rolling them, but he still felt as though it was necessary to do. When you two decide to stop ignoring the very obvious feelings you have for each other. It seemed out of character for the normally not-so-forward introvert, but he could do this kind of stuff with Kaede. The room went silent, apart from Kokichi's slightly loud breathing, Shuichi having to look over to see their reactions. Both blushing, but not a surprise to him. He smirked at their slightly frozen states, focusing back on Kokichi. Shuichi figured he should catch up on some sleep too. After all, it was rather difficult to get comfy when he was duct-taped to a chair. Week 20. Shumai! It was a familiar voice that called out to him. Shuichi was almost not catching the short boy when he jumped at him. He had to admit, it was pretty impressive how high Kokichi had jumped to get his legs around his waist. Perhaps it wasn't actually that high, but he still thought it was impressive. Is something the matter, Oma? He asked, the one in question pouting a little, like he had forgotten something super important. Did he have the time to even think what it could possibly be? No, he did almost drop Kokichi when he kissed him. Yes, he did. It was perhaps 2 weeks ago when Kokichi had kissed him for the first time. It took him a while to get used to, the other saying how he'd just kiss him more because it was good practice. He didn't give him a reason other than the fact that he had wanted to, but it was obvious to everyone that the two liked each other. Excruciatingly obvious to Kaede and Rentaro, since they had already knew about Kokichi's feelings. He didn't give him a reason other than the fact that he wanted to, but it was obvious to everyone that the two liked each other. Excruciatingly obvious to Kaede and Rentaro, since they already knew about Kokichi's feelings towards him. Kokichi sighed through his nose as he pulled away, leaning his forehead against Shuichi's own. I almost dropped you. A warning would have been nice, he commented, the accused one laughing a little as he gripped onto his shoulders more, and Shuichi's waist to ensure that he definitely wouldn't fall. But that's no fun. Besides, it'd seem more boring if I warned you. Your detective skills would have seen right through my plan. Another kiss was currently happening whilst Kaede and Rentaro watched from afar, the blonde's head resting against the side of his shoulder. I knew they'd be cute together, she commented, a light chuckle coming from her partner in crime as he looked down at her. Yeah, almost as cute as us. Kaede practically choked on the air and frantically looked away, turning her back to him. However, that didn't seem to work as Rentaro just hugged her from behind, his chin on her shoulder. You know, your feelings towards me have been obvious for a while. However, it seems more appropriate time to say that I like you too. Looks like they got a little happy ending too, huh? It's almost like a detective novel coming to the end, where the detective finds the last missing piece hidden away in the depths of his... Shuichi started to comment as he watched the pairing he knew was stalking them, seeing them in a tight embrace, but was shushed by a finger to his lips. Now, Shaihara, you know I like it when you start talking like a detective and getting into your stuff. Kokichi started, his hand going back to its original place. But just kiss me already.